we interpret this as a war in eastern Ukraine, struggle over Pokrovsk, Wuhledar, and so on, the capture of towns. As I interpret the Russian position, they see this as currently some combat in a decade-long geoeconomic context. So it's much wider than Ukraine. It's actually global in horizon.
And I mean, there's a message for the West there, because probably the West sees this as just a fight about Ukraine, but it is something broader. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen and we're at the Times and Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Andrew Monaghan, who is an expert in Russian grand strategy. He's previously directed research on Russia at the NATO Defence College in Rome and at Oxford University's Changing Character of War Centre. He's also held research positions at the UK's Defence Academy in Chatham House. He now retains his connection with the NATO Defence College and is also with the Royal United Services Institute in London and with the Wilson Centre's Kennan Institute in Washington, DC. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Now, obviously, we're here at Cheltenham, and you are here to take part in what should be a really interesting panel entitled Kim and Putin, an alliance against the West. To what extent would you say there is now a burgeoning alliance between Russia and North Korea?
Alliance is always a bit of a difficult word. So let's talk strategic partnership first, and let's talk about the implications of what it means for how we interpret Russia. Alliance has all sorts of commitments and so on, and certainly the leaders have talked in that respect, but I'd rather leave it at strategic partnership. It says a lot about Russian activity, which we'll probably come to. Is Russia really at the moment fully allied to Korea? I'm not so sure. Is there a commitment to develop a partnership? I think so, yes.
Ties are becoming closer, though. I mean, we had President Putin visiting Pyongyang earlier this year, and that was his first visit in 20 years or so.
That's right, and that's what we're getting at, is that as you say, 20 years, so just one visit by the president doesn't an alliance make, so to speak. Of course, it's not only Putin's visit. The North Korean leadership visited Russia last year, and last year and this year, fairly senior Russian officials have also visited North Korea. So we notice Putin and Kim, but actually there's quite a lot else going on, and that, I think, is what we'll be trying to explore a bit later. There's military, there's economic and agricultural, there are other strategic questions that are being discussed. So it's an important relationship, and we should think about it in strategic terms, what it means for Pacific security, for instance, as well as what it means for Ukraine.
You hinted there at some of the things that Russia gets out of this relationship. At the moment, for Vladimir Putin, is the most important thing the weapons that North Korea can provide?
James, I think this is a really interesting question, because that's where we have tended to focus on in the Atlantic community. London often talks about this, the US too. Undoubtedly, it seems that Russia has benefited from receiving quite a lot of firepower from North Korean arsenals, and the North Koreans have been quite explicit about that. For me, though, if there's one state that doesn't really need help building artillery shells, it's Russia. So as a bridging aspect, that's true. For me, the important thing, what Putin gets out of this, is positioning in the Pacific. So if you think in terms of strategy and Russian futures and how they view the future, what we're doing is we're moving towards a Pacific century, a Pacific 21st century. And what does North Korea offer? Ports and positioning and a role in that region. Quite a strategically important place and geographical location. So I think it means markets for the Russians, for agriculture. I think it means, of course, weapons transfers backwards and forwards, military transfer technology, of course, to Korea, but also look at the strategic positioning where Korea is.
Is the fact that now Vladimir Putin is making trips to Pyongyang, for example, is that a sign of how Russia has become so much an international pariah, certainly to the West in recent years? Because, 10 years ago, there was still the pretense that he was cooperating with the West, and he would have been maybe more reluctant to visit Pyongyang. Is that a sign of just how much Russia's position in the global order has shifted?
That last part, I think, is exactly right. How Russia's position in the global order has shifted. You started by saying a pariah, certainly as far as the West is concerned. But actually, if we look more broadly, Putin's made quite a few visits recently. We can go through them if you will, but Azerbaijan was a good example, but not only. So for me, what it represents is an acceleration of Russian strategic intent. The Russians, you said 10 years ago, that's the anniversary of Crimea.
Yeah.
So let's say 15 years ago. I think you're probably right. There was a reset going on. But for me, that sense of Russian strategic intent was to diversify its partnerships from North Africa to Sub-Saharan Africa to the Gulf, across the Indian Ocean, and into what Moscow still calls the Asia-Pacific region, and we call it the Indo-Pacific. So it's an acceleration rather than a course change. And I appreciate that's not what people usually focus on, but it's a fairly stated and clear intent in their strategic documentation, in how they view the world of the future. So yes, it demonstrates both things that you asked. The fact that relations with the Atlantic community are essentially cut. They need economic, they need trading partners, they need other partners in the world, but also it's part of how they've intended to shape their politics.
And to what extent is this growing, I mean, I don't know whether you would call it an alliance, Andrew, but people do talk about this group of nations, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Do you think that's fair to group those countries in that way, first of all?
I do. I think it's important to have a clear indication of the changing structure of what Moscow is actively trying to do, and not only Moscow, of course, but speaking from trying to interpret Russian activity, there's a very clear effort to develop relations between Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, Russia and China, and again, not only. So Russia and Azerbaijan, Russia and Vietnam. Some of these work more successfully than others, but we should really be thinking in terms of Moscow's shifting strategic geography. I think that if we did that, it would be more helpful to interpret more helpful to us to interpret Russian activity on the global stage. And we shouldn't just treat them as an alliance, as the axis of evil, or as a dysphemism, let's just be rude about these people. It's a clear effort by Moscow to establish a different infrastructural architecture in the world.
And how much of this actually comes down to repositioning towards the Pacific in order to build trading relationships? I mean, a lot of people have focused on the state of the Russian economy in recent weeks. The ruble took a pounding in the wake of the Kursk incursion. Obviously, there are heavy sanctions imposed on Russia. Is that part of the motivation?
That's certainly part of the motivation. I mean, and I would, again, those things are accurate, so we don't need to worry too much about disagreeing with that. If we're trying to look at how Moscow views the world and therefore interpret what its activity is, Moscow is clear and explicit. There is a long-term geo-economic contest underway about access to commodities, access to transit routes, and access to markets. And a lot of what you see Russian activity, how that plays out, is based on this interpretation of international affairs. So absolutely, it's about reframing Moscow's economic positioning. To the extent I would say that Moscow is positioning itself as a commodity champion in antithesis to our net zero.
That is very interesting.
So I think this is how we interpret, or how I interpret the evidence from what the Russian leadership is doing. It's not simply our economy has crashed or is being crashed by the West, although of course they call the sanctions economic blitzkrieg and so on. It's really about a much longer term shift in international affairs to protect Russia's position as a commodity supplier.
And just on the Russian economy, how would you assess the state of it currently?
Stronger than most people here suspect, and weaker than Moscow would like. We're not going to call the Russian economy dynamically innovative, and we're not going to go in that way, but at the moment it's been quite resilient. It has been shaped to be resilient to economic statecraft. So you mentioned 2014 as that time. Really, since 2014, Moscow has put a decade's worth of effort into making its economy statecraft proof, in inverted commas, so sanctions proof, and that's why it's been able to withstand a number of the sanctions, the increasing sanctions that it faces. Again, we're looking at protecting the strategic heights, so hydrocarbons, agriculture, weapons production, that kind of nuclear power, that kind of question. So I'll return. It's a long way round of saying not as flawed as we think it is, and not as strong as Moscow would like. But don't be surprised if the Russian economy grows at a rate of about 4% this year.
I want to move on to the way the Russian leadership will be viewing events in Ukraine in a moment, but just briefly on the North Korea thing. Are there risks with the relationship with North Korea? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about how the leadership in Seoul will be reacting and whether that then informs their approach to support for Ukraine. What are the risks for Russia if it grows closer to North Korea?
The risks for Russia, as with all strategic questions, are about the relationship not working fundamentally first. This is why I'm hesitant to talk in terms of alliance. We're only at the beginning of what, if we met again in 5 or 10 years, we might be able to call it an alliance. But we're only at the beginning of building that serious set of relations. So the first risk is that the two parties are unable to make their agreements really stand. I think that's what we should always remember with strategy, is that strategy is not simply a plan or a stated intention. It's the ability to resource it and then implement it. And that's a lot harder. I mean, making assumptions about the future, then planning for them, and then implementing them is difficult business. Everyone's always found it. I mean, in history, have found it that way. So the second order is that yes, it provokes a destabilization in the region, as you rightly mentioned, South Korea. So there is a double angle to this. Not only does it create instability on the Korean Peninsula, but it also has ramifications with South Korea. First of all, sustaining sanctions against Russia, and second, of course, supplying and providing support to Russia's adversaries. So you're absolutely right, James. There are a number of risks, but I think we have to speak of those in almost, as like you might say, towing and healing.
Yes.
We're thinking about that all at the same time, always. The intent, the problems, and the potential risks. The payoff is very serious for Russia. North Korea has a large submarine fleet. And as I say, the more important question is to also attune to agriculture, port development, and positioning in the region. So risks, yes. Potential strategic advantages over 5 to 10 years, quite high also.
Let's come on to Ukraine. Is Vladimir Putin happy with how the war is going?
It's a good question, and I don't want to sound glib, but you'd have to ask him that. As from what we can tell, the Russian leadership would have been much happier with the coup de main succeeding. As far as we can tell, there's been some dissatisfaction with that within the leadership. There's some evidence of it, I think, which we can point to. That being said, the Russian leadership has adapted to the problems it's faced and is now pressing quite hard to achieve a secondary and tertiary position. A lot of that will be related to some of the things I was mentioning earlier about infrastructure, about exports, about protection of the Sea of Azov, and so on. Is he happy with it? No, because he would rather it have gone a different way, in my interpretation. Is it leaning in Moscow's favour at the moment? I'm afraid to say it probably is.
And is it in Vladimir Putin's interest to keep the war going for as long as possible?
I would, without rephrasing the question, I would say it's in his interest to resolve it within the next year. But the resolution of it will not be to the Euro-Atlantic community's satisfaction. So stage one, bearing in mind, is that if they resolve this in Moscow's favour, if Moscow resolves it in its favour, it will still lead to a wider geopolitical contest with the Euro-Atlantic community. So it is in his interest to resolve this as quickly as possible. That will not be acceptable to London, Washington, Brussels. Even if he does resolve, it's more important that he resolves this because the contest will last. So we interpret this as a war in eastern Ukraine, a struggle over Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, and so on, the capture of towns. As I interpret the Russian position, they see this as currently some combat in a decade-long geo-economic context. So it's much wider than Ukraine. It's actually global in horizon.
And I mean, there's a message for the West there, because probably the West sees this as just a fight about Ukraine, but it is something broader. Right. I mean, in terms of what a kind of, whether you want to call it a peace agreement or a settlement, a negotiation may look like. I mean, I suppose this is the million-dollar question. Here at the Cheltenham Literature Festival the other night, I attended a talk by Robin Niblett, former director at Chatham House. He knows his stuff on this, and he said that he thinks where this will end up is that sadly Ukraine will end up ceding some of its sovereign territory to Russia in a negotiated settlement, which is not what anyone necessarily wants to see, but is likely in his view. And in return, Ukraine will get some kind of future security guarantee, whether that is NATO membership or EU membership or maybe both. Do you agree with that assessment?
There are clear points of let's call it dispute between how Moscow and the Atlantic community think this is going to resolve. But in general, historically, it sounds almost glib, but war is about a policy dispute, and they all end in negotiations one way or the other. I'm not sure that if there is an armistice or a pause or that the policy dispute is resolved between Moscow and Kiev. It certainly isn't resolved between Moscow and the Atlantic community. So for us to think about, as we were saying in the last question, we probably have to think about it in two tiers. What's going on in Ukraine, as obviously at a human level, the primary and obvious question, but also what causes the war and why. So I think Robin is probably accurate and correct to say at some stage there will be a division of Ukraine, because it's hard to see Ukrainian forces as they're currently structured forcing Russian armed forces out of Ukraine, either back to the 2022 borders or to let alone the 1991 borders. The resources don't appear to be there. Russian defensive capability appears when they dig in to be quite strong. I suspect that Moscow is fully committed to this, so rather than ceding, they would probably escalate further. So I do think it's likely that at some stage a pause will be enacted. But as I say, I don't see that as a resolution of the current combat.
And a lot of people make the argument that if any kind of deal is reached that is too favourable to Putin, he will take it as a victory and he won't stop there. And he will go on and he will threaten the Baltic states, or he will go for Poland.
It's hard to see why. I mean, I agree. I've heard this too. But I'd offer two things. First of all, that the Russian armed forces are currently advancing very slowly in Ukraine. Ukrainian capabilities are not the same as what NATO capabilities are. War is an extremely expensive, both in terms of human life and cost, but also equipment and material. It's an extremely expensive endeavor. It's hard to see that Russians just launching an offensive against Poland or the Baltic states. It doesn't make sense in any way at the moment. So I would shift the question to say, what would be the policy dispute between Moscow and NATO that would cause a war and oblige Moscow to go to war? And then we would have to think about what that war would look like. I do not see it as being a ground offensive into Poland or even less into the Baltic states, because that doesn't resolve any strategic issue for Moscow. And all it does is it leads them into very expensive territory in terms of colossal loss of life and equipment. So I don't see that. I think Moscow trying to resolve an issue around Ukraine. The clear disputes between policy and value between NATO and the Atlantic community are there. I pause though at that line between a resolution and a pause, not a resolution in Ukraine, is not an indication for a Russian acceleration elsewhere.
And when we talk about what Moscow wants and what Moscow is thinking, to what extent are we talking specifically about Vladimir Putin, the man? And to what extent would this still be the Russian policy even if Putin was out of the picture?
Well, you'll notice I very rarely said Putin. I've always referred to the Russian leadership or Moscow. I think a lot of how the Russian leadership views the world is a consensus. There are a number of things that we should be aware of. I think, for instance, that it's not Putin's Russia; it's a collective Putin. So I think we would see a fair degree of consistency. Again, without wishing to sound glib about it, there is no Ed Davey in Russian politics. So
and people hoped it would be Navalny, but it was never going to be Navalny, even had he lived.
You're right, but I mean, people hoped it would be Medvedev. People hoped it would be somebody else. So you hear the verb "hoped." There's a lot of wishful thinking. There is no Ed Davey in Russian politics. So where does this come from? And actually, a lot of how the Russian leadership does its positioning is by trying to interpret international events, economic, political, military, and then placing Russia in that. So the Northern Sea route will remain a priority. China will remain a priority, partly because that's the way they see the world going. I would offer that once there is a form of pause, still I don't have a better word for it. I don't think anybody does, but if there is a form of pause in Ukraine, I suspect you will see Moscow try and renew economic relations with the Atlantic community. I think it's because they view the Atlantic community with a great degree of cynicism, actually, and they think there's a separation between politics and economics and politics and business. I do not think that in itself changes Russia's view that the world is moving towards first the Indian Ocean and then second the Pacific Ocean in terms of international affairs. So I do not see in the bigger picture any structural change in Russian priorities, regardless of who is the president. Let's say somebody else comes to power. Are they going to be able to change within 5 years political culture in Russia? No. Are they going to change military culture? No. So I'm quite cautious about a leader driving change first. Second, we should see it as the collective Putin, because they all came to power at the same sort of time. Some of them have been in power for longer than Putin has been in Moscow, let alone president. I mean, Shoigu has been a federal level minister since 1991. Kirienko, very senior politician, as you know, in the presidential administration, was the prime minister who appointed Putin director of the FSB. And third point, forgive me for going on, but third point, I think this one is quite important. There is a degree of a younger generation taking shape in the Russian leadership. Co-opted, appointed, promoted into the system that is effectively a form of youthification, omolozhenia in Russian. So we are seeing them being a younger generation between 35 and 45 being appointed to positions in the Russian leadership across the Russian system that are essential for managing the current campaigning. Success in that will see them emerge as a serious players over the next 5-10 years. We are seeing the shaping of a Russian leadership to 2040.
And just on that, to finish, how would you assess the strength of Vladimir Putin's personal position currently? There was an interesting article in the Times a couple of weeks ago by the recently freed Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza, in which he said he believes Putin's political demise may come about far more quickly than we imagine, and it could happen any time now. Equally, it could happen in years. Who really knows? But do you have any sense, Andrew, on how long he's got?
I would answer this in two ways. We have become accustomed to mainlining black swans as our views of the future. You know, the highly unlikely but high impact event. We've become addicted to these. In fact, we've been talking about the demise of Putin since 2005. The strike rate for this is approximately zero. So if we look at black swans, this is our futures language, our foresight language. Black swans, high impact but very low probability events. We often don't look at what are called grey rhinos, the highly likely high impact events in front of us. I think we should look at the grey rhino, which is that the collective Putin remains in power for the next 3 to 5 years, which gives us an awful lot to work on, because we can't wait until he has gone to shape our own strategy.
Dr. Andrew Monaghan, really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Times Radio on YouTube. And if you want early access to some of our biggest interviews, sign up as a supporter to this channel via the link below.